going to be talking about topics today that in some sense are at the very top of the conversation in the United States. Inequality is one, which has been a big deal ever since the 1% and Occupy Wall Street movements. Within academia, inequality is now being used as the explanatory variable for everything from the usual suspects like educational attainment and so forth to emotional well-being and a variety of other things. And also there is, you may have noticed, an election going on this year. And Coming Apart has been talked about by a lot of people as a book that explains what's going on with the Trump phenomenon. Both of those issues are going to be in the background as I talk, but I am not going to make this a lecture about the campaign or about Trumpism. I'm going to be talking about some major fault lines that I think have opened up in the United States over the last 50 years that do explain a lot about the Trump phenomenon and have a lot to do with economic inequality, but not as prime. These are not the prime topics, because the kind of inequality that I'm going to be talking about is not economic but cultural. And to tell you why I'm doing that, let's just take as a beginning the fabled 1%. Now, I have not looked up the most recent figures, and if there's anybody in the audience who knows them and I'm way off, correct me. But I think the household income that will put you in the top 1% is around $300,000, $350,000, not a whole lot more than that. Any corrections on that? Okay, you have lots of people in Waco who make $300,000 family income. Lots and lots and lots. And they probably live in nice houses. They probably live in one of the better subdivisions of town. But if they've got a couple of kids in college, they do not feel rich, believe me. And they are not flying around in private jets. And if you go to dinner parties at their homes, the things that they are going to be talking about are going to bear a very strong resemblance to dinner parties in other parts of Waco with people who are not close to the 1%. And that's one of the ways in which you as an audience are different from audiences that I talk about coming apart in front of. Because if I were giving this lecture as I once did at Brown University, or as I once did at Stanford, I'd take a very different approach, because if I were talking about dinner parties in Palo Alto, or if I were talking about dinner parties in Providence, Rhode Island, where in the neighborhoods where the faculty lives, I wouldn't be able to say what I just said. Their incomes are not greater than the 1% in Waco, but the culture in which they live is radically different. And that's the basic thesis of Coming Apart. That over the last 50 years, we have developed classes that are different in kind from anything we have had before. America has always had rich people and poor people. That's not new. But what was the signature characteristic of the United States, and I think the signature aspects of American exceptionalism, was the degree to which we did not form classes on the European model. As Tocqueville himself said, in America, the wealthy, the more opulent members, that's his phrase, the more opulent members of society take great care not to stand aloof from the lower orders. They mingle with them, they talk with them every day. It was an article of faith that if you got rich in the United States, you were supposed to pretend you hadn't, which is to say you were just one of the guys. And so when people in public opinion polls in the United States, it has been almost a joke the way that people who were obviously by objective characteristics were members of the upper class would say, oh, I'm just a member of the middle class. And people who were by any objective measures members of the working class would say, oh, I'm just middle class, ordinary American. Here is the kind of thing that I suppose will get me accused of nostalgia. But as I look around the room and see a few people as old as me, not many, but a few, I think you can verify that what I'm saying is something you can remember from your childhood. I grew up in Newton, Iowa, which was the home of the Maytag Company, once upon a time a famous manufacturing firm, since unfortunately defunct. Well, in Newton, Iowa, there were lots of Maytag executives who could have afforded any car they wanted to. And in those days, you didn't have BMWs and Mercedes in the United States. Cadillac was the luxury car. None of the Maytag executives bought Cadillacs. They would be getting too big for their britches. They would be lording it over other people. And so Buick was as high as they would go. They certainly did not build 10,000, 15,000 square foot homes. That would have been out of the question, not because they couldn't afford it, but that's not the way you were supposed to play the game. There were exceptions to the story I'm describing. If you went to the Upper East Side of New York in 1960, you would have people who went to Harvard and Yale and Princeton and graduates there, and you would have some people who were really, really rich. But even that example gives me an opportunity to illustrate to you how weirdly things have changed. The Upper East Side of New York, defined geographically exactly as it is today, from 59th to 96th Street and from Central Park east to the river, had a median family income in 1960 of $60,000, and that's expressed in today's dollars. $60,000 is not affluent. It's not that there weren't some rich people on Park Avenue and on Fifth Avenue, but in that same geographic area were lots of other people who weren't. In Brookline, Massachusetts, home of the Kennedys at that time, and one of the most wealthy suburbs of Boston, the median family income in 1960 was $75,000. Here's another aspect of the upper class in 1960. A whole lot of them did not have college degrees. In fact, now I don't have these numbers at the tip of my tongue for Brookline and the Upper East Side. It was in the neighborhood of 26-28% of adults ages 25 and older in those towns that had college degrees. That meant that when you went to these dinner parties that I was referring to earlier, you would have at those dinner parties a whole bunch of people who'd never gone beyond that. Well, if you have that kind of cultural heterogeneity, that kind of heterogeneity of socialization, you have all sorts of ways in which people are still in touch with the way ordinary Americans live. You also were in touch with it because even though you lived on the Upper East Side, even though you lived in Brookline, odds are that you were born to the working class, you were born to a farmer, you were born to a factory worker, you were born to somebody who ran a small store. That was the common experience, and even though you now live in a stratospherically privileged environment in 1960, you still remember what that was like. Things have changed. Things have changed enormously. In the case of Brookline and the Upper East Side, by the way, these are not uncharacteristics. In Coming Apart, I have 14 such neighborhoods, and I compare them for 1960 and 2010. But the median family income now in Brookline is about $151,000. Median family income in the Upper East Side of New York is a little over $200,000. But the main thing that has changed is in those towns, almost everybody has a college degree. And very large numbers of them have graduate degrees. And the dinner parties you go to have a very different feel to them now because the socialization of them has been very different. Meanwhile, with the working class, you have had another set of changes, which I will get to in a minute. Let me, though, at this point, tell you how this new upper class came to be. It was the result of some changes in American society which are good in themselves and which had collateral effects that are not so good. The good thing was that over the course of the 1950s, oddly enough, it was during the 1950s that this occurred, not during the much more famous period of reform in the 1960s. During the 1950s, colleges, especially the elite colleges, started to change the nature of their student bodies. I am an alumni, I'm getting my genders mixed up. Anyway, I went to Harvard and graduated from there, and in 1965. The entering class in 1952 in Harvard University had mean SAT verbal scores of around 580. 580 is not bad, but it's the kind of distribution of SAT scores that could have been matched by the upper half of the class in a whole bunch of other private schools and a whole bunch of public universities. You had at Harvard a lot of rich kids, and you had some of them that were really smart. 8 years later, fall of 1960, the incoming class at Harvard had mean SAT verbal scores around 680. In statistical terms, Harvard had gone up by a full standard deviation in the average SAT score. And what that meant was that Harvard, by 1960, still had some rich kids, but almost everybody was really smart. The same thing was happening at the other Ivies. The same thing was happening at Duke and Stanford and others of the most famous elite universities in the country. And by the way, I am willing to bet that a similar phenomenon was occurring at the University of Texas and Baylor, and because anywhere you looked at the changes in SAT scores over that decade, they all were ratcheted upwards. Not because SAT scores themselves had been inflated or anything, but just because we were doing a good thing. We were getting a whole lot more people who could profit from a college education into colleges. That's wonderful. The collateral effect was that you created critical masses of people who could form cultures quite distinctive of their own. I will go back to the example I know best of Harvard Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts. When I was there in the early 1960s, there was definitely indeed a different culture within the walls of Harvard, within the classrooms and so forth. But as soon as you walked out of Harvard Yard, you were in pretty much a middle class / working class neighborhood called Cambridge, Massachusetts. Many of you in the audience or in the faculty, I'm sure, have spent some time in Cambridge. And if you go back that far, you had a few specialty stores near the square, Harvard Square, that sold stuff you wouldn't ordinarily get in Des Moines. But other than that, hardware stores and a variety of other things that you'd find in any working class / middle class neighborhood. You couldn't get away from it. Now, if you go to Harvard Square, you will first find restaurants of every conceivable ethnicity and every conceivable price range, something you certainly did not have then. You will have all sorts of boutique stores of other kinds. And just to give you a sense of how things have changed, at Harvard Square, you not only have one Whole Foods store within walking distance, you have two. That's how far Harvard has changed since 1965. It has become, Cambridge, Massachusetts, has become an enclave of an intellectual elite and also an economic elite, because people in the kinds of industries that employ residents of Cambridge pay really good money. Well, that has been happening in elite centers throughout the nation. And the four that are the most important for our purposes are the areas surrounding Washington, D.C., New York City, Los Angeles, California, and the corridor that runs from San Francisco to San Jose. Because if you think about the elite that runs the country, the people whose activities can have an impact on the national economy, the national culture, the national politics, a huge majority of them come from one of those four places, because that's where the action is. Those are also the places in which what I call the enclaves of the new upper class have gotten the biggest and most insulated and isolated. I had in coming apart, I had a socioeconomic index to rate zip codes. And what I did was combine the U.S. Census data for zip codes on median family income and percentage of adults age 25 and older with a BA or more. And I ranked all the zip codes in the country. And I then looked at the top 5% and called them super zips. It turns out that 5% was way too generous a statement of what constitutes super zips. Because actually, when you get a zip code in the 95th percentile on my index, you drive through it. It is not going to look like a wealthy neighborhood. It's not going to look like a special neighborhood at all. It's when you get up in the top 1% of zip codes that things start to look different. In Washington, D.C., which is the center for the movers and shakers of politics and many of them in journalism, almost everybody who is anybody in Washington, D.C., in those worlds lives in one of about 11 zip codes that go from the downtown D.C. in northwest in a cone up through northwest D.C. and into places called McLean, Virginia, and Potomac, Maryland. Of those 11 zip codes, all of them are in the 98th percentile or higher. All but 3 of them are not just in the 99th percentile, they are in the top half of the top percentile. Altogether, if you broaden the definition of zip codes to super zips to include 5%, you have 1 million people in the Washington, D.C. area in contiguous zip codes that are all super zips. Similar stories can be told about Silicon Valley, about some of the suburbs of New York, and Manhattan itself, which used to be a place that had a few wealthy neighborhoods, but an awful lot of working class neighborhoods. Essentially, everything in Manhattan from 96th Street south is a super zip now, and a great many of those are in the top centile. I would not be surprised if in another 15 or 20 years, all of Manhattan will be super zips. It's changing that rapidly. Why is this bad? Well, it's bad in terms of the ways in which elites in this country have become isolated from mainstream America. And when we think in terms of Donald Trump and his appeal, that's a very important reason for his appeal. This incredibly strong sense on the part of people in America's working class, and I'm thinking specifically of the white working class, which is my topic in Coming Apart, are quite aware of the disdain in which they are held by the elites. Now, again, I'm speaking in Waco, which is and I'm not saying this to suck up to you, which is a much healthier place than Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Stanford, or the other places, or Northwest Washington. I don't know how much you will see this, because I don't think in Waco you have that many people who openly disdain the working class. But I assure you that if you go to dinner parties in the elite enclaves and you refer to flyover country, everybody knows exactly what you mean. And also, at those same dinner parties, you can use the one ethnic slur. No, there are 2 ethnic slurs you can still get away with in this country, and nobody will call you on them in the elite zip codes I'm talking about. One of them is redneck, and the other is a pejorative word for evangelical Christians. Nobody will give you any pushback if you refer to them in a disparaging way. This has not been lost on ordinary Americans. They know the extent to which they are deplorable, to use a word recently used, that they are seen as deplorable by the elites. That's one problem, and it has created a lot of the energy behind Donald Trump as a candidate. Another problem with this kind of isolation is that we have people increasingly making decisions who have no way to empathize with the situations of people whose lives are being affected. A specific example I like to use is truck drivers. You know, if a truck driver cannot empathize with the life of the Secretary of Commerce, that doesn't really make any difference to anybody. If the Secretary of Commerce, who is overseeing a cabinet agency that regulates the life of truck drivers, cannot empathize with the priorities of truck drivers, he or she is likely to make some really dumb choices about the rules used to govern the lives of those people because they don't know what's going on. They are isolated and they don't know what they don't know. Now, when I got to the point in the book where I was trying to address my readers who were members of the new upper class, and I wanted to get them to understand what I was saying, I ran into a problem because how do I get them to, because any statistics I could give them would allow them to get off the hook. So I decided to write a quiz instead. And the quiz was entitled, How Thick is Your Bubble? If you go to the NewsHour's website tonight, you can take the test online. They posted it online after I did an appearance on NewsHour some months ago. By the way, I've got over 90,000 complete scores on that. I'll come back to that in a minute. Anyway, what was the test about? Well, it was designed to get my readers to understand for themselves that they were clueless. I wanted them to persuade themselves that they were clueless. So some of the questions were good social science questions. Have you ever lived for a year in your life in a neighborhood where more than half of your neighbors did not have college degrees? Have you ever lived for at least a year in your life below the poverty line? Graduate school does not count in that. Yeah, I know, graduate students, I know you're poor, but you're not poor the way that I'm talking about in terms of poverty. So you have the good social science questions. I will also specify, this is intended, I was writing Coming Apart about white Americans for reasons I can explain, but I'm not going to go into right now. And I'm concerned about the isolation of white elites from other white Americans. So the quiz is not one that's going to give you an accurate measure of your familiarity with a variety of other aspects of American culture. But here are some of the other questions. Have you or your spouse ever purchased a pickup truck? Have you, in the last year, have you or your spouse ever stocked your fridge with a mass market American beer? I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the disdain that the new upper class has for Budweiser and Coors and Miller's is almost palpable. They just won't drink it. It's terrible. If their beer has not been brewed by Belgian elves, they are having none of it. Just the right color, and all the rest of that. And then there are some questions that I think are really, really important. One of them is, have you ever walked on a factory floor? Almost everything that we have, that we wear, that we use, everything, just about all of it was made in a factory. I didn't say have you ever worked on a factory floor, although you get extra points for that. But have you ever seen one? Do you know what they sound like? Do you know what the machines look like? Do you know have a sense of just what it's like to be in a factory? Well, if you don't, just consider the degree to which you are sheltered from a huge sector of society. And the other question, if I had to pick one question that I would say is the most important of all, have you ever held a job that caused a body part to hurt at the end of the day? If you have not, if you've never done that, carpal tunnel syndrome doesn't count for this one either. Neither do headaches. If you have never held a job where something didn't ache at the end of the day, you are fundamentally unable to empathize with people who do hold jobs like that. You can feel sorry for them. You can wish that they had better working conditions. You can have all sorts of noble intentions for improving their lives, but you don't understand a damn thing about what it's like to have that kind of job day after day. So the test was administered. It achieved its didactic purpose. And much to my surprise, it turns out to be a powerful psychometric test. Psychometrically, it's a powerful test. And I know that now because of these 90,000 scores I've got from the NewsHour. So I have the score on the bubble quiz. And I also have, because the NewsHour very generously asked these questions at my behest, I have the zip code where they live now, and I have the zip code where they lived at age 10. And I also have their age. And believe me, I did not construct this test with item analysis and pretest and all that. I just built it. The distribution of scores is almost a perfect normal distribution, which is hard to do. The correlation, the bivariate correlation of your bubble score with the socioeconomic status of your zip code is about 0.4. And in the social sciences, a correlation of 0.4 is pretty good. It's not too far below the correlation of parental and child IQ. It's pretty close to the correlation of income and IQ, to take another topic that I've written about in the past. It's a pretty good test. Here's the really interesting thing. And by the way, I've never published this, and I've never said it in a speech. You're the first to hear it. I did regressions recently, where I enter the bubble score as the dependent variable, the thing we're trying to explain, and my independent variables were the age of the person as a control variable and the SES index score and a couple other things. And then I entered separately the two elements of the index score, education and income. That correlation of the bubble score with socioeconomic status is driven entirely by education. Once you control for education, the importance of income drops out. That's the reason I could say that at a dinner party in Waco, you can have people who are a lot wealthier than the rest of them, and probably you aren't going to have the same kind of isolation, because the nature of the educational socialization they have received is way different from the nature of the educational socialization that has been received by most members of the new upper class in Northwest Washington or in Silicon Valley or in New York City, which is to say they have not undergone the same kind of elite socialization that people who have gone to a lot of the elite schools have experienced for a lot of years of their life, and the subsequent socialization of being in those kinds of elite zip codes. So I'm going to end the discussion of the new upper class just by pointing out that it is here. It is not going to be fixed by any income redistribution policies you can think of. It is grounded in the most normal of human preferences, and that is to be around people who get your jokes, to be around people who are like you, who understand what you mean when you say things, people you like to hang around with. And these enclaves that I have been talking about have not been formed by evil people who are trying hard to separate themselves from the rest of American society. They've made some money, they can afford a house in a nice neighborhood, they've looked for places that they'll feel at home, and guess what? They end up with people just like themselves, something that the United States has gotten very good at doing, sorting ourselves into very separate bins of education, of political ideology, and a variety of other things. All of this has led to an alienation of the upper class from the rest of America that is simply un-American in terms of our history, and it's new. Now let me turn to the other side, and that is the new lower class. There has been a lot in the newspapers this year about this phenomenon. Some of you will have heard of these statistics before, but I will give you the comparison from 1960 to 2010 that I used in Coming Apart to give you a sense of what's going on. In 1960, you had a few, wait, no, that's not the right way to preface it. There are a few institutions in American life that have been absolutely central to America's civic culture. One of those is marriage. Another of those is what used to be called industriousness. Americans were famous for wanting to get ahead, for working long hours, for being way too preoccupied with their work, so that you have Europeans saying condescendingly, Americans live to work while Europeans work to live. Well, yeah, and I sort of feel sorry for the Europeans who feel that way, because as far as I'm concerned, work is one of the leading ways to happiness. That was the second of the things. Religiosity was a third characteristic of the United States that was considered by all of the founders, including deists like Thomas Jefferson and, for that matter, George Washington. Religion was considered absolutely essential to the functioning of a free society. Because if you were not going to have laws that constrained the behavior of people, you really needed religion as the moral guide for preserving a free society. These institutions, in which just about all Americans participated, have changed in the following way. People toward the bottom of society have dropped out of them to a very large degree. Start with marriage, which I think is actually probably the pivotal institution, and look at 1960. I'm talking now about whites ages 30 to 49. I choose that age because age of marriage has gone up since 1960, and age of retirement has come down since 1960. But the 40s and 50s, 30s and 40s, I'm sorry, 30s and 40s remain now as they were then the prime years of life. White males ages 30 to 49, 1960, 96% of them were married, if I remember correctly. As of 2016, I updated these numbers for this lecture. As of 2016, the percentage of white males married in that same age group was down to 52%. By the way, I think I overstated it. I don't think it was 96%. I think it was 86%. It was a very high number, and it's now barely more than half of all males in their prime of life. Why is that important? Because the family is the unit of social life historically in the United States, the married parent family. And when that changes, the whole nature of life in a community changes. The nature of social capital changes, and the quantity of social capital takes a huge hit. Because a great deal of the social capital in communities, social capital, I'm referring to everything from formal activities like running for city council to informal things like making sure that somebody shovels the walk after a snowstorm with a little old lady across the street who can't shovel it herself. This wide range of formal and informal glue that American communities have historically called upon as a way of dealing with its problems and as ways of governing itself. That takes an enormous hit when marriage goes downhill. The fact is that single dads very seldom coach Little League teams. And that example could be extrapolated to lots of other things that don't happen when you no longer have married couples as the dominant force in the community. Another thing that changed from 1960 to 2010 was industriousness. And again, I'm going to use males as the example in this case because the labor market situation of women changed so revolutionarily during that same 50 years. In 1960, about 96% of all white males ages 30 to 49 were in the labor force. That's where I was thinking of that statistic earlier. As of 2016, after several years of recovery from the Great Recession, at a time when unemployment rates have been falling steadily for 4 or 5 years at least, you had 21% of white males of that age group not even looking for work, or looking for work and not having it. You had labor force participation of only 79%. That betokens a huge change in the attitude toward work. To have been an able-bodied male in 1960 and not even be looking for a job was to be a bum. It was to be a bum in the opinion of your parents, of your girlfriend, of your male friends, of everybody else. It was just a sign of moral and character weakness. And that's no longer true. That's a huge change in the culture. And religiosity. Religiosity has declined across American society. Secularization has been a real phenomenon, but here I got a surprise. I had bought into the cliche that the pointy-headed intellectuals have become secular, but the middle class / working class are the bulwark of American society, and they're still holding the line on religion. Well, I was right about the pointy-headed intellectuals. If you go to take polls of faculty at major universities, especially elite universities, very large majorities of them self-identify as agnostic or atheist. But if you're just talking about the upper middle class, which is a much broader group, secularization has increased, but you still have about 3/8 of adults who are not only participating in a religious tradition, but participating meaningfully, not just going to church on Easter and Christmas. Meanwhile, in the working class, you're down to about 1/8 of adults who have that kind of affiliation with a religious tradition. So in the upper middle class, religion is still a large enough group that they form a moral backdrop to a community. In the white working class, that's no longer the case. They're increasingly oddballs. In this, we now get two kinds, I think, come back to the sources of energy for the Trump phenomenon. You've got two things going on. One is a lot of people in the working class are still trying hard. They're doing the right thing. They are trying to get jobs, or if they hold jobs, they work hard at them. They have seen their income stagnate for decades now, and that in itself is demoralizing. They have also seen the kind of disdain on the part of the elites that I referred to earlier, which is demoralizing. And they are also seeing a lot of people around them in their own communities who are not playing by the rules, and that's demoralizing. And all of those things, I think, are contributing to the kind of anger that feed into the disaffection that Trumpism has given voice to. Then you have another group. You have a group, and I'm going to stick with males again because I don't have anything against criticizing females, but in this case, males are a better target because they have been behaving more badly. You have stunning statistics on the number of hours that able-bodied men out of the labor force spend playing video games. Stunning statistics. I hesitate to quote them for fear that I'm misremembering them. Hours and hours a day. You have the phenomenon visually. It was not me who made this observation. It was a woman in a working class community. She says you're walking down the street and you see a woman and she's got a baby in one arm and she's holding on to a couple of grocery bags in the other arm, and behind her is this guy sort of slouched along playing a video game on his iPhone. She says, "What's wrong with this picture?" Well, there's something very seriously wrong with that picture. And it speaks to disorganization in the communities whereby they also, I think, are attracted by a Trump. In part because he's great entertainment. I'm getting further into politics than I intended to here. But he also, well, let's put it this way. In many ways, they don't realize that they are the malingerers and the bad guys. There is a book that was published just a few months ago that has now gone to the top of the bestseller list, called Hillbilly Elegy. And I highly recommend it to all of you. It is written by a guy who grew up in Kentucky and Ohio, and he was an honest-to-God Kentucky hillbilly. And the culture he describes is one, I thought I've had plenty of exposure to working-class communities. I've never had exposure to the kind of culture he describes. It's really something. But he describes working himself in factories growing up, and talks about the guy who didn't come to work on time and would take half-hour bathroom breaks every few hours. And then he got fired, obviously, after not too long a period of time. But he was highly indignant. I've got, my girlfriend's pregnant, you're firing me. This is wrong. He had no sense whatsoever that he had been behaving in a way which guaranteed he would get fired. And so I think you have a lot of the people who feel just as demoralized and disaffected as the guys who are playing by the rules, because they see themselves as victims as well. Well, the bottom line on all of this is that the America that was characterized by an American creed that emphasized egalitarianism, emphasized individualism, emphasized freedom, that America is pretty much gone. There are lots of different culprits for why it's gone, but the way we are now, for whatever reasons, is increasingly like a class society in Europe, except that our lower class is more dysfunctional than the European lower class. This is the point at which I should conclude with my solutions for that. My line here is that I'm a libertarian and libertarians don't do solutions. And I am unable to do so in this case as well, except that I think that what is needed is a kind of civic reawakening. America has had at least 3 and maybe 4, depending on which historian you read, religious great awakenings. One in the 18th century, one around 1820s, another one in the latter part of the 19th century, and arguably one in the 1970s, all of which had enormous effects on America's more general culture. We have had secular great awakenings in the form of the civil rights movement and in the form of the feminist movement. In the case of the civil rights movement, it goes to show that things can happen quickly. The civil rights movement went from pretty much a standing start in 1954 to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in a decade. That's a huge cultural change. The senators and representatives who voted for the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 were not leading the nation. They were following. There had been a sea change in the attitude toward the way that white America had treated black America in just 10 years. Well, we need a sea change in the culture. And I think it's got to be led by the new upper class. In many ways, the new upper class behaves pretty well in their own lives. They get married. They are usually excellent parents. They are industrious. They do all of these things that are very traditional middle class values, if you want to think of it that way, but they refuse to preach what they practice. They will get married themselves. The out-of-wedlock birth rates for ratios for the upper middle class on up are 1950s levels, single digits, whereas they're about 40% for the whites in the country as a whole. But they won't say to the rest of the country, actually there's real advantages to the two-parent married family. No. Instead, they say, well, we must understand that the family has evolved, and it no longer means the old Ozzie and Harriet married couple with children. We have all sorts of new forms of the family, which we do, but they won't say, you know what, marriage really seems to work pretty well for us, and maybe this is something you ought to consider. I don't mean that they should take bullhorns and go down to working class neighborhoods and broadcast this. I mean it should be in the air that this is a really good thing for children. This is a really good thing for community functioning. This is a really good thing for people's happiness and well-being. Doesn't happen. There has to be a kind of civic reawakening in which the new upper class starts to do that. And there has to be a civic great awakening in which the new upper class regains a sense of seemliness. Regains a sense of, you know what, even if you have the money to build a 15,000 square foot house, you shouldn't do it. And regains also a sense of fellow feeling for their fellow Americans. And the only way they are going to do that is if they change their lives so they are not walled off in these enclaves where they never encounter middle-class America. What are the chances of us having that cultural reawakening? Probably not good. Probably not good, because it's hard to see where the forces are going to come from to make it happen. As I look around America, I'm as depressed as I imagine a great many of you in this audience are, no matter what your political beliefs may be about what's been happening. That's a terrible way to end a lecture. I will just point out this. People have underestimated the United States and our traditions and our civic culture in the past. And in the past, we've had a way of surprising people. So I do not put it out of the question that it won't happen again. But one of the ways we can help make it happen is to be aware of how deep the problem is. And I hope at least I've helped with that. Thank you very much.